Welcome everybody. This is the Geopolitics of American 2020 election, and I'm just going to dive right into this stuff. So, what we do here at the American Geopolitical Society is we do two things. We give a course and talk about the introduction to geopolitics, the principles of classic geopolitics, and then the second part of the education is comparative geopolitics. In other words, you have different countries that live in different regions from a geographical point of view. And so the circumstances and the needs for those peoples or countries, nations, or regions are completely different. And so, how does their geopolitical outlook compete with a different region on the planet's geopolitical outlook? In other words, the United States has a very specific geopolitical strategy. Russia has a very specific geopolitical strategy. China has a very specific geopolitical strategy based on their needs. And so the other part is that we teach where does that authority come from? So who has the ability who's putting the policies together? Who has the knowledge to put that policy together? And then who has the authority to actually implement that policy? And then we follow those policies. And then we find out how the world works. So that's what we're doing here. And so this is a kind of a mini course for the election coming up November 3rd. And our aim is we're in the realm of comparative geopolitics, what happens is that when you look at how countries are competing against each other, and you look at what the Russians are saying, and you look at what the Chinese are saying, it reveals the truth on what's going on, because you can see the real moves from the West. You can see the real moves from the East. And that's why we do it that way. And that's why people get addicted to comparative geopolitics. So the people who've taken my course or courses, it usually strings along from, where's the next market's going to come from, and how are those going to form? What trade blocks are they going to be part of? And we'll get a little bit into that. But what I want to do is today we're going to be talking about some of the information coming out of Russia. How do they look at Trump? How do they look at Biden? And that'll kind of reveal on exactly what's going on in the United States, this massive competition between Trump and Biden. Because from a political point of view in the United States, it's not Republican and Democrat. It's not that black and white. All right. So think about this. Trump's a conservative. George Bush Jr. was a conservative. But why is George Bush Jr. and you got guys like Mitt Romney, Bill Kristol, and all these neoconservatives, why are they against Trump? And that's something that's, because the way our media works in the West, nobody gets the right amount of information to where they can actually crack that mystery. So we're going to conquer that today because we know exactly what's going on and how it's happening. So it's a very teachable moment. And what I'm going to do, the first part, is I'm going to go over a little bit of the classic geopolitics, a reminder of what it is that we're all competing for, how it works, the formulas. And then I'm going to get a little bit into the gentleman that we're going to read two articles in the second part. But I want to introduce to you guys the people who are putting the policy together from Russia's perspective, their school of geopolitics. Who has the authority and why? We'll talk about we'll show you what they talked about, what they put together, and what they said they were going to do, and how they fulfilled that. So you're finding out who has the authority, and then actually watching every move that's being made. Okay. And then the second part, I'm going to read two articles. Again, one of the things I want to throw out there, you guys, is that we don't have an opinion here at the American Geopolitical Society. It's not coming from the left. It's not coming from the right. It is what's on the table and how are they competing. That's it. That is it. We're not interested in people's opinions. We're looking for who has the authority. So I'm going to read two articles that kind of reveals on how China and Russia and the EU and these different entities look at this election coming up and what's at stake for them. In other words, from a business perspective, when I talk about geopolitics, when it comes to election time, it's you have to have a business plan. If let's say let's go back to Mitt Romney and Obama, that election. Okay, so you had a business plan if Mitt Romney won, and you had a business plan if Obama won. That has not changed. So if you look at it from Russia's perspective, their geopolitical strategy, oh, Biden's a completely different animal than the President Donald Trump. So how do they look at it? What is it they see, and what they have to do to prepare to move their agenda forward? Okay, so we'll read from their articles, and it's a little bit long, but you guys will, I think it's one article is about 8 pages, and the other article is about 2 pages. And then the third part, I want to bring in General Flynn, because now that you will know what's going on and what's at stake, how's it being played out since Trump got elected in the first place? And how has the competition in the United States tried to block that? What's interesting, doesn't matter if you're for it or against it. This is what's going on. So it's very, very interesting. And then we'll close out this little mini course with a couple more maps that I'll show you guys. On people talking about, it's gloom or doom, you guys. If Biden wins, it's gloom. It's the world's going to come to an end. If Trump wins, the world's going to come to an end. So we're going to look at some maps and just kind of look at a reality, because if you look at from state to state, that's kind of an illusion. You have some states that are Democrat and some states are Republican. All right, but when you look at it from the bird's eye view of counties, it's a completely different picture. It's a completely different picture. And so we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll get into classic geopolitics. I wanted to be able to share on some of the strategies that I use on how to measure classic geopolitics a little bit. In other words, if you were to go into a country and measure where are they at as far as a entity, can a country be taken down? Can it be destroyed? And we'll kind of measure the United States a little bit. And it doesn't necessarily mean they have to be doing that bad. What you do is, again, it's comparative geopolitics. What's the state of the United States compared to Russia? What's the state of the United States compared to China, our competition? All right, and we'll get a little bit into that. So anyways, let's just jump right into this. So this first and foremost, for people who have never had a chance to talk about real geopolitics and what it all merged into and what everybody looks at. What's interesting is that if you take Russia, China, the United States, the EU, India, and Japan and all these big players, okay? Obviously, there's socialism, there's communism, there's constitutional monarchy, there's capitalism, all these isms. Then you have Orthodox Christianity, which is different from Catholicism, which is different from Protestantism. So there's different forms of Christianity. Then you have Islam, Shia versus Sunni. Those are two different churches. And on and on and on. But geopolitics reveals a common denominator. And this map right in front of you is all that what countries need, and what it is that how we look at the world, and what's how we compete is all on this map. It's the main map for geopolitics. It's the foundation of it. So when you learn about geopolitics, you learn who created it. These are the guys who actually, the map that you're looking at, who created these theories. So first things first, all right? So if you look at that blue, that's the rimland. The United States or the West controls the rimland. And what we've done is we've surrounded the heartland. So when they first created these theories, and these theories were based on geography, they were based on material, and they were also based on manpower. All right, so what parts do you have access to? And then is there consumable material there? And then what access do you have to human population? All right, what that produced was a formula. And these guys looked at history all the way up until all the way up when this started coming out. The British Empire went from 50% of the world's GDP. The British Empire literally owned 50% of the world's GDP. and then it got down to 25%, and then it started being attacked by the Germans and other countries that were um, starting their industrial revolution. But what they discovered was, going back and looking at there's formulas, and what that formula is that you have you have manpower, you have material, which equals production. Production equals wealth. Wealth equals power. All right, that's the formula that every single entity on this planet is following. And what's interesting is that, I usually teach this from a business point of view. I usually go into corporations and they want to know what's going on. They want to know what's happening with the hybrid warfare, shatter belts, and where's the next hot spot? How is this going to affect markets? But corporations are following that exact same formula. And why shouldn't you, from a personal perspective? Manpower and material equals production. Production equals wealth. Wealth equals power. All right. So what happens is it kind of starts formulating this map that you guys are seeing here. And in the blue is, we'll talk about the verse theory first. The red, the heartland. Going back through history, if these guys came up with that, the pivotal point of history was the heartland. All right, there was empires in the blue, but who destroyed those empires? Who actually the Mongols, the Germanic tribes? So you look at that and you take China and you put China in part of the history, and the heartland they considered was the pivotal point of history. So with that, what they came up with is that he who controls the heartland controls the world island. And I'll show you another pic coming up that'll illustrate what they mean by the world island, because it does not include North America, Central America, South America, and Australia. It is on that map what you see here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but Africa, Eurasia, and this is considered the world island. But there was another gentleman, and the guy who came up with that was his name was Mackinder. There's another gentleman who came along. His name is Speakman, and Speakman advanced that. Remember, the world with transportation and how we do things gets smaller and smaller and smaller. He came up with the theory, the rimland theory. So if you can control the rimland from the sea, you're blocking off the people from the land power, from getting access to the ocean. And if they don't have access to the ocean, then they can't, they can't advance. So the rimland theory. And so let's advance that first theory that we talked about, the heartland theory. He who controls the rimland controls the heartland. He who controls the heartland controls the world island. And so that's how that theory is broken up. So what does the United States and the West control? We control that blue that you see in that map. What is Japan? What is Russia trying to do? Russia's trying to break out of that containment. Russia wants a warm water port so they can have complete and access to the oceans. If you look at the ports that they have right now, they're frozen parts of the year. If you look at the port that they have in Syria, you could block that at the Suez or at Gibraltar, all right, in Mediterranean. You can block that off. They do not have an open ocean port. So that's what they're after, and they want to control Eurasia. So what's the main project? What's the main aim for Russia? They want to control Eurasia. They want to create a Eurasian empire. Same thing with China. Why? Because that's where most of the material and most of the population is at. And it's a very simple formula. And so the United States, our philosophy, and this goes way back to World War I, okay? And this is bridged from the British Empire. So what helped form that decision-making tree before World War I? The British Empire owned 50% of the world's GDP. As other countries started to advance, that ownership in the world's GDP shrank, all right? Germany comes along and says, we can do better. Wilhelm and these guys, they basically say that we can compete against the British Empire. We're going to build the second largest navy, and we're going to lower the value of our currency, and we're going to kick the Industrial Revolution to high-end production. And when they did that, you could see that the British Empire at that time owned 25% of the world's GDP. And every step, whenever the British lost 5% more of the world's GDP, it was the Germans who were making up for that. The Germans were taking over that. They were taking over the British market. All right, so that was them competing because they understood production equals wealth, wealth equals power. They kicked it in high gear. The second part of that was that um, the British Empire looked at Germany and they looked at Russia as a threat. In other words, those two countries couldn't get together. The British Empire could never defeat that. Now, what I'm talking about, the principle that I'm talking about, will have to do you guys, this has everything to do with Biden and Trump. This principle I'm talking about right now. So you kind of have to write this down and pay attention because, after we go through these three-part course, a lot of people will forget that, but this is the reason I'm throwing this out there. So the way that we look at it, the West, is that we needed to make sure that Germany and Russia never got together. The other part is Eurasia. So what's that have to do with World War I and Eurasia? Well, the Germans declared that they're going to build a railroad from Berlin to Baghdad. And that was going to cut off the British interest, the British Empire and the British interest from Eurasia. That could actually cut them off. And so that was a no-no. So these are the things from a geopolitical perspective, what created their policy. They formed their strategy, and that helped form their decision-making trees. All right, so, and the United States is right with it. We could not afford Germany and Russia getting together. That's something we couldn't compete against. World War II, we couldn't afford to get Germany and Japan together. That would have been a no-no. All right, after World War II, you had the Cold War. The United States could not afford, now that we were the world power, could not afford China and Russia getting together. So Kissinger and Nixon goes to China, and they're secretly trying to separate the Chinese from the USSR. They succeeded. They succeeded in that. And so what's the next step? What's the next step? What's happening? And this is where Trump and Biden come in. This is where Trump and Biden come in. So this map explains everything, all right? This map, look at that map. The Korean War, Vietnam, World War I, World War II, Iraq, Afghanistan, all right? We're keeping Russia in containment. And everything you'll see when I talk about the policy coming up here in a minute, the gentleman I want to introduce you to who came up with, he was the forefront of Russia's policy, how to get out of containment. So they have a policy and strategy to get out of containment, and that containment, their number one goal is to take over Eurasia and to have a warm water port. So it counters the Rimland. So their language that they use, it's the sea people versus the land people, and that was invented from basically the people who invented geopolitics, Mackinder and these guys. Okay, so that's a different course, and we'll have that up for you guys so you guys can the introduction to geopolitics and you'll learn all that. But so this is kind of a mini course. So anyways, you understand this map thoroughly and you get a bird's eye view, and guys just go back and take a look at it whenever you get a chance and study this because this means everything. This is how the United States thinks. All right, how do we put our strategy? Look at our bases that we have. We're keeping China out of the Pacific, where we control the Indian Ocean, we control the Atlantic, and our bases are strategically all over the planet to make sure that Russia is in containment and or China doesn't move. In other words, what's Afghanistan? Afghanistan is what they call center of the chessboard. And that game's been going on since 1850. We'll talk about that a little bit here in a minute. So let's move to the next slide. The world island. So everything that's in yellow is the world island. And you notice Australia and also the Americas and some of the islands off Australia, some of the countries, New Zealand and these countries are part of the world island. And the reason it's not specifically, and also Japan's not part of that, it's because, remember, it has to do with manpower and material and access to those two things. The Quan, what's the ultimate? where if you can get the resources to that human population, and where's the biggest human population at? And so that's where you start formulate that realistic logic, that realism, which formulates these maps that these guys created. So the world island. Alexander Dugan, and this is the gentleman that we're going to be reading in part two, where that's going to reveal what's going on with those principles that we just talked about. So what's going on? This is the reason I want to throw this guy up there, because remember, the USSR fell in 1991. And I have another chart that's coming up that's a perfect illustration on the entities that Russia sees they have to compete against to defeat the West. And so I'll show you you guys that here in a minute. But what I want to do is introduce this guy, because in 1997 he wrote a book called The Foundations of Geopolitics. All right, so what that book is, it's Russia create its own geopolitical school. They watch what the British Empire did and have. They watch what the United States, their geopolitical strategy, and they realized that what they were lacking. They realized that they were lying to themselves, quite frankly, is what he said. So they went back to the drawing board. And Alexander Dugan represents that new policy that came out. So in chronological order, 1991, the USSR fell. 1997, 1998, the country of Russia defaulted, and his book came out in 1997. Ironically, I was taught geopolitics in 1991, classic geopolitics, and I thought I had a very good grasp on it, and I think compared to everybody else, I think I did. I think I understood exactly what was going on. Very good, because I taught this stuff, all right? But it wasn't until 1997, 1998, because Brzezinski came out with his book, and it's called The Grand Chessboard. And one book was How to Get Out of Containment, and the other book was How to Keep Russia in Containment, how to control the Rimland, how to make sure nobody can take over Eurasia and use the resources and manpower against the West. All right, then it clicked. I mean, I understood how everything was going on. So I encourage you guys, The Foundation of Geopolitics, it's a hard book to get because they don't sell it. And if you can get it, there's a company out there that was selling it, and they basically they fib a little bit. They say it's in English, and when you get it, it's in Russian. The other one, the Foundations or the Grand Chessboard, you guys can get. You can go Barnes Nobles or something like that and get it. So two great books, but they explain thoroughly the difference between the West, the Rimland, and the Heartland, and Russia, and that competition. And then they also explain on how China is a part of that. So moving forward, so this is what came out of Alexander Dugan's book. Because if his book is so it's you guys, a lot of people try to downplay this book, and I don't get it. One of the things I've come across in geopolitics is people downplaying geopolitics. They just simply don't have a clue. So they say, you don't need that. So when I give a talk and I'm talking to professors or something like that, what I do is before I start talking to them, I'll ask a bunch of questions, because I want to see where they're at. Not only that, but they, in the middle of it, you show them something very cool, and they're like, I knew that. It's like, no, you didn't know that, because at the very beginning here, I asked you, so I kind of keep them at bay when I do this stuff. But I get every once in a while, people are saying, well, this guy's not that important. And then okay, so here's the question for you. Alexander Dugan, he's not that important. Putin doesn't listen to him. Who else has written books on geopolitics and geostrategy in Russia where you're a colonel on above and you have to take these courses? He has another course that's out, Alexander Dugan, and it's more advanced than the first one because obviously they've advanced. Time goes by, different things happen, different strategies. Nobody has that, what Alexander Dugan put out. He is the authority. All right, so if you look at it from this perspective, the USSR fell in 1991. Russia defaulted in 1997, 1998. The Foundations of Geopolitics came out with an exact agenda on what they need to do. to get out of containment and take over Eurasia. And then in the year 2000, Putin was elected. He became um, the ruler of Russia. All right, it's that simple. And then we'll show you through these slides on exactly that, how that time frame came up. But Alexander Dugan. So remember, this book was written in 1997, and me showing you this stuff is to show you who has the authority. Because I'll show this to people, ex-military officers and people who are in the corporate world. They're like, "Oh my God, that's prophetic." It's like, gentlemen, this is not prophetic. This is engineered. This is why you watch this guy. This is why I'm doing this and showing you guys this, where the authority comes from. So when I read his articles about what they think about the U.S. election, it gives it backing. So war against Atlanticism, and that's who because we're a sea people and we have the biggest navy in the world. That's how they describe us. So usually when I get into crowds that try to talk about international policy and stuff like that, I'll ask them about this stuff and they don't have a clue. Their knowledge only goes so far. You guys, it's impossible to have a complete picture of how the world works without knowing this language or knowing classic geopolitics. Comparative geopolitics is a tool to advance you even beyond that. I mean, to be able to have those measuring tools to know exactly what's going on. So Russia is to rebuild its influence through annexation and alliances. Military operations play relatively little role. Depend on sophisticated and subversion, destabilization, disinformation spearheaded by the Russian special services. Operations should be assisted by tough, hard-headed utilization of Russia's gas, oil, and natural resources to pressure other countries. And that's what they've been doing. The Finlandization of all of Europe. Germany should be offered the de facto political dominance over most Protestant and Catholic states located within Central and Eastern Europe. Because the reason they're saying that is that to make things work, they want to remember what we talked about at the beginning here, where the British Empire and the United States, we could not have a united Germany and Russia. All right, so how does Russia unite with Germany at the same time let them be independent? It's like, well, wait a minute, what's that mean? Well, Russia is Orthodox, Germany is Protestant and Catholic. So that's why they're saying, look, we can unite at the same time. You guys have your civilizational rights, and we have our civilizational rights. And we'll talk about that here in a while. So that's part of their Europe strategy. Remember, this came out in 1997. Kaliningrad should be given back to Germany. Moscow-Berlin access. That's been a threat to the West for a long time. France should be encouraged to form a Franco-German bloc with Germany. Both countries have a firm anti-Atlanticist tradition. The United Kingdom should be cut off from Europe. And you guys know Brexit. All right. So, and the thing about it is that from American perspective, it's like, oh my gosh, it's a Russian operation going on. You guys, the nationalists in England, the United States, didn't want the European Union to form in the first place because it's anti-state. It's anti-state. The Russians looked at as a united Europe as just competition all around. So Russia and the United States had a common enemy if you're a nationalist. All right, and that was broken up. Finland should be absorbed into Russia. Estonia should be given to Germany. Latvia, Lithuania should be given a special status, the Eurasian Russian sphere. Russian geopolitical agenda, 1997. Poland should be granted a special status in the Eurasian Russian sphere. Romania, Macedonia, Serb Bosnia, Greece, Orthodox Collective East will unite with Moscow, the Third Rome, and reject the rational individualistic West. So what's that mean? Macedonia, Serbia, Bosnia, Greece, they're all Orthodox Christian. All right. So what Russia wants to do, obviously they want to get out of containment, and they want a warm water port, and they want to take over Eurasia, where they're in their minds, their manifest destiny that they're trying to create. They want to create an imperial religion, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be Orthodox. But part of that imperial religion is their moral standard is civilizational rights, which is completely against what we have out in the West. They don't, so in other words, we have no, as the West has no right with the liberalism or its version of Christian conservatism to go into the Middle East and proselytize with Islam, or go into China or to Orthodox Russia. So that's kind of how they're doing it. And instead of state rights, and they do believe in states, but it's a little bit different. They believe in civilizational rights. They completely reject individual rights. In fact, I have a sizzle reel that I'm doing for a company on the head of the Orthodox Church in Russia. They keep attacking individual rights, and that's part of their play. So remember, from a moral perspective, what they're trying to create is a imperial church that represents that type of morality. And what we did to give you guys an example, what we did to counter that, remember, they wanted to take over the Ukraine. They couldn't do that, so they took over the industrial part of Ukraine, where the money was coming from, or production, I should say. Production equals wealth, wealth equals power. So, they had a religious grip on the Ukraine because they're all Orthodox. So what the United States of the West got Ukraine to do was create the Orthodox Church of Ukraine to separate themselves from the Orthodox Church of Russia. So you would never even know what that means unless you understood what Alexander Dugan is doing here. In fact, when you guys, in 1997, most of this stuff made absolutely no sense. Now that it's actually happened, it's like, not only does it make sense, but it should scare you a little bit, because these guys are hitting it every single time. They're hitting it every single time. Ukraine should be annexed by Russia. Russian geopolitical agenda in 1997, Middle East and Central Asia. Russia needs to create geopolitical shocks within Turkey. These can be employing the Kurds, Armenians, and other minorities. Armenians or Orthodox, okay? Well, Armenia was the first Christian country in the history of all mankind. People don't know that. And they're surrounded by Islam. So, not the best position to be. Russia regards the Caucasus as Russian territory, including eastern and northern shores of the Caspian, territories of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and you guys understand that. So that's part of the Russian strategy. Establish continental Russian Islamic alliance. Again, what they're looking at, how are they trying to team up with Islam? And they've only had success so far with the Shia end of it. And that is to guarantee their civilizational rights. And that morality is coming from an imperialistic Russian Orthodox religion. So you guys got to understand, when Putin got into office in the year 2000, they went from communist to socialist, almost to capitalist, and all of a sudden Putin shows up and they go to, they went Orthodox, all right? Even though that's a religion, it's like, their religion, they're playing with things here. Their religion is their weapon, and it's part of their strategy. That's part of how they're going to do things. They believe in isolation. In other words, you go back to Peter the Great, and they make sure they're not dependent on anybody, so nobody can mess with them. Nobody can control their economy. Nobody can attack their economy because they're self-contained. All right, and that's part of the Orthodox religion, or the Russian, what they're part of their strategy. So, establish continental Russia, Islamic alliance. This is the foundation of the anti-Atlanticist strategy. The alliance is based on the traditional character of Russian and Islamic civilization. Iran is key ally. Moscow-Tehran axis, because Moscow is using Tehran as the main proxy to be able to try to break out of containment. There's a reason why the United States surround Iran with bases. There's a reason why the United States has completely blocked Iran's economy. Okay? So we know what they're up to, and that's exactly why we're doing it. That's why we're there. Armenia, strategic base, subsidiary, axis, Moscow, Arabian Tehran. According to Moscow, Armenians are an Aryan people like the Iranians and the Kurds. Now, word for word, I put up here what Alexander Dugan put up here. So, why he put Armenians are an Aryan people like the Iranians and the Kurds, I couldn't tell you. I talk to people who watch and follow everything that Alexander Dugan does and says, and nobody's ever asked him. I've never heard him. So I don't know what that means. But you guys, they're obviously teaming up with these guys. They're using them. Given Azerbaijan could be given to Iran. Georgia should be dismembered. Um, Abkhazia, and United Ossetia will be incorporated into Russia. Well, guess what they did? They took over Georgia. They took over. So, one by one, they're knocking this stuff out, you guys. So from reading this in 1997 and watching them click off this list is kind of fascinating. Russian geopolitical agenda 1997, Asia, China, to the maximum degree possible, be dismantled. So think about this: the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That's the BRICS. But before the BRICS showed up, this is what the Russians said: China to the maximum degree possible to be dismantled. And we'll talk a little bit about that in part 2 and part 3. But I don't want to get too far ahead here. Russia, take Tibet, Beijing, Mongolia, Manchuria as a security belt. Russia should offer China help in southern direction, Indochina, except Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Australia as geopolitical compensation. Russia should manipulate the Japanese politics by offering the Kuril Islands to Japan and provoking anti-Americanism. Obviously, that hasn't worked. In fact, Japan has gone from a defensive weapon for the United States. I don't know if you guys noticed this, but we're turning them into an offensive weapon for the United States. So that's a different posture, all right? Mongolia should be absorbed into Eurasia and Russia. Russian Geopolitics, 1997, United States of America. So let's see if you guys can click some of these boxes off to check the box on what Russia has done. Remember, this is written 1997. Russia should use its special services within the borders of the United States to fuel instability, separatism. For instance, provoke ethnic resistance. Russia should introduce geopolitical disorder into internal American activities, encourage all kinds of movements, extremist, ethnicity, sectarian groups, thus destabilizing the internal political process in the U.S. Does any of this sound familiar to you guys? Support isolationist tendencies in American politics. The Eurasian project could be expanded to South and Central America. So imagine that. Right there, he said the Eurasian project. So what is Russia's main goal? Is to take over Eurasia, because that's where most of the resources and the manpower of the world are at. And we're there to either control it. If we can't control it, we'll make sure nobody else can control it. That's the West's policy. That's the West policy. But again, I wanted to read this and put this together for you guys so you can understand who put this policy together for Russia. Is Russia following it? Absolutely they are. And so this gives backing on the articles I'm going to read in part 2. So here's a pic that I put up there, and not the best art in the world, you guys. So I had to put this together real quick because the original pic that I had a corporate name on it that I used and so I just kind of had to make one that's real quick. But the polar timeline, the bipolar, unipolar, multipolar world, 1991 to 2002. All right. The point of this slide is to show you how Russia looked at how the West defeated them. All right, so let's go through this. If you look in the white, Chatham House, 1929, British Empire. All right, so during World War I, the British became very, very nervous that the war was getting close to London. And so they ruled the world. They had the formulas and they understood exactly what they needed to do to rule the world, control the rimland. All right, that advanced a little bit later, but they still, parts of India, that type of thing. They understood it better than anybody. And so the United States they considered as they needed the United States as an ally. And so they created the CFR. And that bridged the geopolitics and that type of strategy to the United States was through the CFR in 1991. And we're going to talk a little bit about conspiracy theories here in a minute, but we'll get through this. The British Commonwealth, 1993. Bretton Woods system, 1994. That was after World War II. The IMF after World War II. Whereas IMF did people that are not part of the American or the West system, we give them loans and we try to draw in the resources through those loans. The GATT is tariffs on how to protect our economy from our enemies. Notice that little date on there it was created 1945 and it ended 1995, and we'll talk about that here in a minute also. NATO created 1948. The Bilderberg Group, which is the one of the pinnacle the conspiracy theories out there. What are all these groups designed to do, by the way, from the American perspective? If you look at the top, the people who put our policies and strategies together, the United States is a trade empire. So each and every one of these entities that you see in the white are designed to make sure the United States can trade, and we're ahead of everybody else, and then we can also protect our trade empire. The spearhead of that is the United States Navy. All right, the Trilateral Commission. That's a different group, because now you're taking the power from the United States, and the idea was to spread it from Japan, the United States, to Europe. So they shared that power. Globalism, Trilateral Commission. Then in 1973, we created the SWIFT system. Remember, 1971, Nixon had a problem. The amount of gold that we had and the size of our economy, we couldn't print a efficient representation of dollars that we needed based on how much gold we had. So that was a threat. Also, you had France and these guys saying they're going to take their dollars and they're going to exchange it for gold, and it would deplete our gold supply. And so we had to create a new system, and SWIFT was part of that. If you want to do business with the West, you got to use the SWIFT system. And then in 1995, we created the WTO. It was official. All right. So that's what Russia looks at. When Alexander Dugan, when the USSR fell, they had time to sit back and assess, how did the West beat us? What is it they're doing? I mean, there's proxy wars, but what is it they're doing? How did they do this? So look at Russia. The USSR, it started 1992, it ended in 1991. That was the Union. That was their their side of their alliances. Comecon, 1949, 1991, that was their economic union. All right, that crashed in 1991. The Warsaw Pact, that was their equivalent to NATO. 1955. So we created NATO in 1948, and the USSR is like, okay, well, we need to counter that, and so they created the Warsaw Pact. All those were defeated. And so what did they come up with? In the blue. Look in the blue. The USSR ends in 1991. They put together the foundations of geopolitics in 1997. 1997, 1998, Russia defaulted. The country itself defaulted, had to get a $60 billion loan from the Rothschilds. So the first thing they do is they start to get there with the Chinese, and they're trying to build another block. So the Shanghai Group, 2002, that leads to creating the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, 2009. And the ECU, 2010. So that's the Eurasian, trying to get Eurasia to form into a economic union. All right, they're different types, but one is they have a couple of them. Think about this: the NDB, the AIIB. If you look in the blue, those are equivalent to the IMF. So they have two versions of IMF. That's why it's kind of strange when I've been to Brazil and stuff like that, and they're talking about the capitalist system and the IMF and all these conspiracy theories. Like, look, you cheese dicks have two versions of that. And if you look at the contracts, so when we created the IMF, and one part, you guys, there's more than one reason, but one part was to be able to give loans to these these countries that were not part of our system, and through loans we can actually pull them into our system. Those contracts, those agreements, the NDB, the AIIB, which is the IMF just for Asia, from the BRICS point of view, it's a carbon copy. They're the biggest hypocrites on the world. Here's the thing, they're not hypocrites, they don't know. They don't know very specifically what the BRICS was created for. So Russia is competing in the blue, is competing with everything that we have in the white. That's their strategy. So from an economic point of view, that's what they're doing. From a military point of view, they're advancing their military with from the money they get from selling oil, and they build an alliance with China. They're building alliance, trying to build an alliance with Iran, and that's how they're breaking out. So it's a carbon copy of what we have, and people just simply do not know this. So if you guys are hearing this for the first time, it makes me very, very happy, because that kind of cracks the big mystery. All right. And here's the thing, you guys, if you look at the conspiracy theories that are out there, what are they attacking? They're attacking everything in that white column. Alexander Dugan, the guy that we just went through, in the early 80s, or it might have been the early 90s, he wrote a book called Conspiratology. And basically, it was a study on conspiracy theories. Their plan was to take every conspiracy theory that's out there and turn it against the West. And it doesn't matter if it's right, because they understand that the population of the United States, 2% suffer from schizophrenia. All right, they understand this. So no matter what, they're gonna amp that up. But I used to teach anti-conspiracy strategies from 94 to 2000. And what they did is very brilliant. Before the United States was even formed, you guys, there was anti-Catholicism and anti-Protestant conspiracy theories out there. The Jesuits, and then you had the Masons, and they were at it, and the Illuminati and all that stuff. How that stuff is created. All those conspiracy theories was Protestant versus Catholicism. They took that, and then they're using those exact same accusations, and they've moved it forward to where it's attacking these organizations today. As people, you try to go back and you look at where they came from, that's what we did. Where does most of these conspiracy theories come from? Give you an example of one. Morals and Dogma. All right. And so in that book was supposed to be that there's the Masons. The Masons predicted and planned 3 world wars. Like, oh my God, that's chilling. Makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, right? It's like, oh my God. Well, if you go look, and I even bought this book when I was younger, because it's like, oh, I got to see that. And it wasn't in there. And then later on, when I was doing this bit with anti-conspiracy theories, it's like, well, where's this coming from? Where did it come from? Well, there was a gentleman from a retired commander from Canada. He was going around and telling everybody how the Masons said that they're going to create 3 world wars. And it was all in their book, Morals and Dogma. You can all go look at it yourself. Well, people started going around and looking. And it's like, well, there's nothing in there that says that. And then it come to find out, it's like, well, it's in the London Museum. It's in there. That's where it's at, and you'll see it in that book. Well, come to find out, it wasn't there. And they asked the museum in London, or the London Museum, do you guys ever have such a book? And they're like, what are you talking about? So they started to investigate. It's like, where's this guy coming up with this stuff? Come to find out that he got it from a bishop, a Catholic bishop, and from Chile. None of it was confirmed. None of it. But guess what? That conspiracy theory is used today. Here we are, 2020. Completely out of. But so what the Russians have done very smartly is they thread this stuff along, and they keep it going. But they take control of it. So a lot of what you see in the news is exactly that. It's kind of funny because I've actually been kicked off social media just for mentioning Alexander Dugan. Obviously, you guys, I am the arch enemy of Alexander Dugan in Russia, all right? I'm Atlanticist, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, traditionalist, all right? So there's no way that anything is going to fit. I believe in individual rights, all this stuff. So it's kind of weird. But to give you an example on how much control, what I'm talking about, you guys, Alex Jones, right? One of these conspiracy theory guys. Well, how is it that Alex Jones was fine for some 15, 20 years? And the day after he interviews Alexander Dugan, that's when the media went nuts on him. They cut him off from everything. Is because they don't want, Alexander Dugan he didn't create the conspiracy theories, but he's taken them over and using them to their advantage as anti-American, anti-US dollar, anti-Atlanticist propaganda. And so Alex Jones, I don't know if he knows that he was a part of that, or I really don't know. Maybe it was just an innocent interview, but that's why everybody cut him off, because it's like, okay, come on. And that's what happened to Alex Jones. So it goes with what we're reading with today. But you guys have to understand, this is Russia's strategy. This is the foundations that they've built. Now, the BRICS is a very, very important organization, all right? But the United States, if you look at what Trump has done, he's pivoted Brazil towards the West. The last president in Brazil was giving money to Hezbollah, got rid of that guy. So this guy that's in Brazil, he's pro-Israel, he's pro-West. We've pivoted India towards the West, and now you see India and China are having border disputes. All right, so this is just it's ongoing. It's ongoing, but now you understand why. So we're breaking up the BRICS. But what's genius about the Russians is that the BRICS was a preliminary organization, a preliminary, their main goal is to create what you guys see up here in the blue, but have a Eurasian economic union. That's what they're doing. That's their ultimate goal. It wasn't the BRICS. The BRICS was just, how do we do this? Think about it. Russia doesn't produce anything. They don't know how to be capitalist or compete in a capitalist point. So, they had to build the BRICS. But they're not worried about the BRICS falling. What they want, their main goal is Eurasia, because that's where the world's population and the resources are at, or the resources that are around it. What's the biggest population that it has a chance getting to, where you can take it from production, turn it to wealth, which will turn into power. So very principle-based, ladies and gentlemen. And one last slide for this first part. If you look at this map, I found this map on the internet. I have a map that's equal to it, but I wanted to, again, I don't want people to, I'm not putting out my opinions out here. I refuse to do that. So the map that I made, there's a couple of opinions that are in it, okay? This is not. So I don't know who put this together, but they got it all right. But look at this black line from 1915, the First World War, and then 1945, the Second World War, the pivotal point, and then 2005, which is Afghanistan, and then the new pivotal point, the new heartland plus pivot, is in this green triangle. And if you look right down here, southern Pakistan, that's where Russia wants to build a warm water port. So that's where it's kind of slid down to, okay? And very, very interesting. But again, let's do a small recap, okay? World War I, we needed to make sure Germany and Russia didn't get together. We also needed to make sure Germany didn't build a railroad from Baghdad to Berlin. Or I'm sorry, from Berlin to Baghdad. That was a no-no. Because if you look at it from, the way that they built the geopolitical maps was that you had these infantry and these guys, the cavalry on horses, right? And that was their movement. Well, ships can outflank that on the coast, but inland they can't. And so that's why the West had an advantage in the rimland. But guess what? When railroads came along, that kind of changed that a little bit. And so we had to figure out different strategies. We had to make sure that from the ocean to a certain point within the heartland, that there was military activity to make sure those type of railways and those type of alliances didn't form, so we can keep the heartland in containment. So very interesting stuff. But remember, all this stuff leads up to just who has the authority here. What is actually going on from a real world perspective, the reality. It's manpower and resources. And then it's different alliances to make sure that each country, if they can't control certain parts of manpower and resources, they make sure nobody else controls it. And that's what creates, through hybrid warfare, the shatter belts. So very, very interesting stuff. And you guys, there's a lot more to it than this. Okay, there's always more. Even the courses that I've given, you never have enough time. You never have enough time. But the whole point is to make sure that you guys understand. We had to make sure that Germany, Russia didn't get together. We had to make sure that in World War One, we had to make sure that Germany or they didn't conquer each other. Also, Russia took over Germany or Germany took over Russia. We need to make sure that didn't happen. We need to make sure that Germany and Japan in World War II didn't get together and somehow come together. All right. And then after that, we needed to make sure, because Russia and China did come together. USSR and China did come together. China was never part of the USSR, by the way, but they were partners, and so we had to separate that. You remember, that's the main focus. That's the principle why we're having this conversation. So again, Biden versus Trump. Biden versus Trump. Part 2 is coming up, you guys. I hope you guys enjoy this, and we'll read a couple articles.